Hello class, and welcome to this module on the logic of congressional action. Okay, so we are here. It's late at night for me. I'm in a ridiculous sweater, and I'm here to give you a mini lecture on the logic of congressional action. And now this might seem like, haven't we talked about this before? Well, we've talked about agenda setting. And we've talked about policy design and the perception of different problems and how problems get defined. And we've talked about causal stories. But what we don't have is a unified theory about why Congress takes the action that it does. And this is what Arnold offers. And it's such a seminal work because since its writing in 1990, nothing has made as good sense as this particular model. And it's very important that we understand it because it's so accurate in a way of predicting how and why the conditions under which certain policy is enacted and why Congress takes the actions that it does. So what do we do? How do we begin with this? Well, the first step that Arnold takes, which is great because it's the first step in so much great political science research, is Arnold identifies a puzzle. Now, the puzzle stems from two different types of policy that Arnold observes to be happening in Congress, right? He defines policy as either particularistic, right, or of diffuse benefits. Now, particularistic benefits relate to how sometimes policy can be benefiting a small, very particular type of group, whether that's an organized interest or an interest group, or maybe a geographic region, right, like the legislator's constituency. And with respect to these policies, it's not quite puzzling to political science, right, because we can understand why members of Congress push this kind of policy through. Oftentimes, especially with respect to the geographic benefits, they can come back to their constituencies and get reelected as a function of claiming credit for these great policies, right? In turn, the particularistic policies that relate to interest groups and organized interests, these interest groups definitely care about this public policy. But the degree to which voters more broadly either, observe these policies, right, because the interest groups are definitely keeping tabs, but the voters are less so. And even if they did know all about them, would they care? It's unclear. So these particular policies are if they were costly, to the constituency or to a major group, right? Especially given that voters aren't really caring about them, they're not gonna take action on this, right? It's pretty clear cut, not big puzzles there. But what about these diffuse benefits policies? Well, sometimes they're not so puzzling, right? Sometimes the diffuse benefits have low costs on everybody and have such strong benefits that, of course, Congress is going to pass it. Why not, right? No brainer. But a lot of times, these diffuse benefits policies actually have large-scale, big-time, high costs. And they have high costs on groups that matter, or they have high costs on the geographic regions that matter to a congressperson. The large groups in the population face these costs, and they're visible, right? How and why do policies like that pass? That's puzzling. And so what Arnold does is he's offering us a unified theory that sure, the dependent variable, right, the outcome of interest is policy, but it's breaking it down into the smaller pieces, to the actors, to the individual groups that are interacting. And he's breaking down for us how these interactions shape the conditions under which different policies move forward, right? And it's just pure gold. So the three groups that he's thinking about and how they're interacting are citizens, legislators, and coalition leaders. Now, before we go any further, it is important to note, right, at the get-go, that at the heart of his theory is this idea of re-election once again. Now, it's not a new idea that Congress people are driven first and foremost by an interest in being elected or re-elected once they get into office. This is not new. We know, Mayhew talks about this a great deal. We've talked about Mayhew before. Fenno, who we haven't talked about, but if you've ever taken a class in Congress, you've definitely read him. If you plan on taking a class on Congress, you will read him. He wrote a book called Home Style, and this one is talking about how members of Congress are forming relationships with constituencies, right? These are really seminal works, and they all definitely think very importantly about the role of re-election and Congress people's decision making. But Arnold is introducing a whole nother dimension to this that's really key, and we'll get to it in a minute. But all I want to say is that he's not saying that the only thing they care about is election. What he's saying is that they're looking through a lens, like a lens that's shaping all decisions, right? They have lots of, different preferences out there, but all of these preferences are viewed through a lens of how is this going to help me, or how is this going to hurt me when I run for re-election, right? And it's both help and hurt, and they're estimating things based in that. So that's their dominant preference, and it's the preference through which they evaluate all other preferences. So if that's the dominant preference, then naturally at the heart of Arnold's theory are citizens, right? And citizens' preferences. But before we get to that, that's like at the core. The guys that are around, right? The coalition leaders and the legislators, let's talk about them first and dive into some slides.
Okay, first things first, the legislator. What explains congressional decisions, right? How do legislators make their own decisions? And then we can aggregate that and understand congressional action, right? Well, one thing that Arnold notices and puts forth for his theory is that legislators are constantly facing dichotomous decisions, right? Their worlds are dichotomous. And this means that they're faced with a decision. They can either pass the bill or, vote against a bill. Or they can either accept an amendment or they can reject an amendment. They can vote to recommit a bill or vote to allow it to pass out of committee, right? They can, they can accept or reject procedural motions. All the decisions that they're faced with are either yay or nay, right? And they're faced with them constantly, but they're always paired alternatives. It's either this or that, and that's key. Right? So when they face these decisions, they're thinking, okay, I have A or B, yay or nay. How will my yay vote impact my chances at re-election, right? Compare that to how will a nay vote, right, impact my chances at re-election. This is the decision-making process of a legislator. And so what Arnold wants to investigate is how this estimation process goes, right? How exactly are legislators estimating electoral consequences? And so that's at the key of his theory. Now, what about these coalition leaders? Well, coalition leaders, in contrast to legislators, do not live in a dichotomous world, right? They're not just making decisions yay or nay. Instead, they are selecting problems from all the possible problems out there, right? They're defining problems and they're bringing proposals up to legislators as the alternatives, right? They're defining the choices, yay versus nay, and they're putting them forth to legislators to decide, right? So that's why they're not living in a dichotomous world. They're the ones shaping the dichotomous world of the legislators, and they hold a lot of power in this respect. Arnold introduces these characters, these actors in this theory as both inside as well as outside Congress, right? They can be, coalition leaders can be drawn from, rank and file legislators that hold a lot of prestige within the body. They can also be committee leaders or subcommittee leaders, maybe party leaders, staffers even within Congress. They can be the president. They can be the president's staff, right? The chief of staff for the president. They could be a department head, but they can also be interest group leaders. They can be leading coalitions, mobilizing people on the ground. They can be experts, right? They can be political entrepreneurs. These are people who are coalition leaders, and what they do is they're anticipating legislators' decisions, all right? And then thinking about that and anticipating and estimating those decisions. How are the legislators going to think yay versus nay? They are then defining problems, right? To help structure the proposal strategically, right? To shape majorities such that the problem is defined, the proposal is introduced in a way that gets more yays than nays.
Okay, quick pause so that we can just highlight two things. One, that legislators are always choosing between paired alternatives, right? That they're either choosing A or B, and then after they choose B, okay, then they choose C or D, and then after they do that, they just do one or the other, dichotomous choices. Like, it's a simplification that actually practically makes good sense. And then in turn, it adds such logical value, right? Then we can logically understand how pathways form. So cool. Just like this is a moment to observe how sometimes modeling makes really good sense. It takes a genius, but if they can figure out the accurate way to simplify, it ends up being a game changer. So there is that A, okay? Now B, legislators are choosing amongst these paired alternatives, and they're looking at the two, and they're thinking what's going to have, what's going to be electoral consequences, right? And that's how they're choosing. And so we have that. And then we have the coalition leaders who are looking at legislators making choices, and they're saying, okay, so we want to give forth the choices that are going to make the best sense for the legislators thinking about elections, right? So at the heart of everyone's anticipations are citizens, right? Legislators are thinking about citizen preferences, and then in turn, coalition leaders are thinking about legislators thinking about citizen preferences, so they have to be thinking about citizen preferences also, okay? So citizens are once again at the heart. Let's think about their judgments.
Okay, so as we start to think about this relationship, right, the relationship between citizens and the policy judgments they make, right, their opinion about policies, and how this influences legislator decision making on the individual level, Arnold, in his review of the literature and the scholarly wisdom, tells us that, in fact, the prevailing consensus is that policy issues actually play a very small role in congressional elections, right? That, in fact, the decisions of a legislator on specific policies, the public opinion about those policies is actually not going to influence their chances at re-election as much as we might think, right? And this is kind of about public opinion on the particular policies may or may not matter that much with respect to a candidate's chances at re-election.
Okay, another quick hold the phone, right? You might be thinking to yourself, hold on a second. Dr. Wiener was telling us a couple weeks ago that public opinion does seem to have a strong influence on policy. And now Arnold's saying that it doesn't? Like, what's going on? Well, the key thing here is that they're thinking in different levels of unit of analysis, right? Because public opinion has been seen to shape the overall policy outcomes, like what policies end up seeing movement and which ones don't, right? That's what we have talked about previously. But what Arnold is talking about specifically here is thinking about individual congressional actions, right? And so thinking about on the constituency level, what are the public preferences there, right? What are the measured public opinion within a constituency? And how does that impact the actual activities with members of Congress representing that district? And that tie is a little bit harder to gauge. I mean, any of the methodological issues that we talked about with respect to public opinion more broadly and policy, the other measurements of public opinion as they connect to public policy, right? Those cower in comparison to the methodological issues associated with trying to make this more individual link. So that's the difference there. Now, back to the slides.
Okay, so despite these methodological challenges, right, and the fuzzy connections quantitatively between citizens and individual legislator decisions, qualitatively, we actually see a strong relationship between this, right? Because qualitatively, and we return here to Kingdon's work, Kingdon observes that legislators are thinking about citizens and their responses to their decisions all the time. In almost every decision that they make, this is at the forefront of their consideration. And the thing is, it's not just that they are thinking about the current policy preferences, right? Because oftentimes, as we also know from Burstein, sometimes the public has no opinion on a policy issue, right? But it's not that. It's actually the anticipation of the potential preferences, right? It's the idea that should somebody be educating voters, mobilizing voters, telling them about my choice on this policy issue? I want to make sure that my choice is the type that can help me get reelected rather than hurt me in my chances of getting reelected.
Okay, so here's where I start to get really excited, right? Because this is where the major contribution of Arnold comes into play, or at least one of them. Okay, so it's in anticipating, constituent preferences. A legislator is not just thinking about and estimating the current policy preferences of his constituencies, right, of the voters. He's actually, or she is actually anticipating, potential preferences, right? Unrealized, unmobilized, not yet understood or even known at all by the public, right? But that potentially could be in the future. So, I mean, it's not actually that big of a logical leap, right? If I'm estimating, the current public opinion, why not estimate, what's potentially in the future public opinion, right? And it's also getting at the heart of what members of Congress are actually thinking, right? Based on this qualitative research that Arnold cites, is that, yeah, okay, like maybe the voters don't know about this now, and maybe they never will. But the fact of the matter is, somebody's gonna run against me in my campaign, next fall. And when they do, they're going to be looking through my record and looking for opportunities to come at me and mobilize the voting base against me in order to win that election. And is this the policy that they find, right? Is this the vote that kills me? That's what I need to be thinking about, right? So they're not just thinking about how does the public feel about this right now, and that's how I should vote. No. They're thinking about how might the public think about this in the future. And that is a super, super interesting and very important contribution. And it's at the heart, right? The potential preferences. This is at the heart of Arnold's model.
Okay, the model. We have three groups of actors: citizens, legislators, and coalition leaders. We also have four decisions that routinely are made in order to shape the overall congressional action. Okay, now first, citizens establish policy preferences by evaluating both policy proposals and policy effects. Policy proposals are predicting in the future about how certain policies can or may influence me and my life. But policy effects are thinking more about what is the state of the world I live in now, and how can I trace that back to particular public policy. Second, citizens choose among congressional candidates by evaluating both candidates' policy positions and their connections with policy effects. Okay, so now this is a separate step, right? Because citizens not only have to evaluate policy, they then have to incorporate that evaluation into their electoral decision making. These are two separate steps, and they're thinking about the policy positions, right, and those predicted impacts of the policy proposals, as well as the connections candidates have to the current state of affairs, right? The policy effects. Now, legislators, their decisions. Legislators are choosing among policy proposals by, one, estimating citizens' potential policy preferences. And that's like the first, the first decision we just talked about. And then second, estimating the likelihood that citizens might incorporate these preferences into their voting decisions. And that's the second, right? That's the second decision. So that's why the model breaks up citizen decision making into two separate decisions, because citizens have to A, develop preferences, and then B, incorporate those preferences into their electoral outlooks, right? Who are they going to vote for and why? And then finally, 4, coalition leaders. Now, coalition leaders are adopting strategies for enacting their policy proposals, right? They have agendas, and they're thinking about how to, strategically put forth and create these proposals by anticipating legislators, there's an R there, electoral calculations, right? Which in turn requires them to estimate potential citizens' policy preferences and also estimate the likelihood that citizens feel strongly enough about these preferences to matter in voting, right? So they're doing all the decision making and taking the first step to create this world of policy proposals.
Okay, so there you have it. You've got the three groups and you've got those 4 decisions. And how the 3 groups make those 4 decisions shapes the logic of congressional action and shapes our understanding of how to answer those questions, those puzzles in the very beginning, right? Now, how do they make the decisions, right? What are the answers to these questions? How are these decisions made? Well, that is covered in the remainder of the book. Now, unfortunately, I can't, this isn't a graduate class, so I can't make you just read the whole book and write a paper on it by next week, which is, by the way, exactly how graduate school works, in case you're interested in that path. But instead, what we'll do is I will review it all. We'll do it together on Thursday. We'll use some slides. It'll be all the fun, and I cannot wait to see you then. So take care, and looking forward to it.